Before the railroads, before telegraph wires crackled and split the sky, there were people in search of something very simple, warmth enough to make it through tonight. From the frozen peaks of North America to the smoke-choked kitchens of medieval Europe, fire was both salvation and snare, and cold was the silent law of the universe. Between those poles of heat and frost, people built faith, invented devils, laid out meals, and wrote tragedies. Step into a journey through three spaces: the trapping mountains, the medieval kitchen, and the cloister and streets of Paris, where hunger, faith, and desire both gnawed at and shored up the soul. They were not looking for God. They were looking for beavers. The promise of wealth from the fur trade was the magnet that pulled them west into the frozen heart of North America. But wealth is a relative term. To them, wealth mostly meant not starving to death while chasing beavers through snow up to your waist. They had seen the edge of the known map where it read, "Here be devils," and thought, at least there are no creditors there. The first lesson every mountain man learned, often the hard way, was that cold is not an enemy. Enemies have feelings. Enemies can be defeated, bargained with, or at least hated. Cold is different. Cold simply is. It doesn't care whether you live or not. It is the ultimate law of physics. It is the universe's absolute indifference made manifest as temperature. You can't threaten it. You can't bribe it. You can scream into the wind all night long, but the wind has more important business, mainly finding a way through your bearskin coat. Their relationship with the cold was a negotiation. You do not fight it. You bargain with it. You offer it respect, and in return, it gives you one more day. Grow arrogant, forget to check whether your boots are damp, and it will take a toe as a reminder. Frostbite isn't an if, it's a when. Fingers, ears, nose, all have shelf lives. The scars of frost are the mountain's signature, etched into the flesh of fools who dared to think they could conquer it. A veteran trapper is recognizable instantly by the way he does everything with his left hand, because the right is now a useless black lump. They watch the greenhorns from the east, those fresh-faced dreamers who think a single layer of wool is enough. By nightfall, those dreamers turned into shivering philosophers, meditating on the chain of bad decisions that brought them here. The mountain men didn't care. You only curse what can hear you, and the cold is stone deaf. They had their own thermometers. If your spit freezes before it hits the ground, it's a cold day. If the whiskey in your flask freezes, feed the fire. If you freeze, the lesson is over. We think of cold as an inconvenience. They knew it as law. If cold is an unfeeling god, then fire is a fickle, temporary savior. For mountain men, warmth wasn't comfort. It was money. Every spark was a coin yanked from death's bankruptcy. Every ember, a check that read, "Congratulations, you get one more hour." Making fire in a blizzard isn't a skill. It's an argument with nature. And nature always hires the better lawyers. A man would kneel, fingers so numb they might as well be clumsy sticks. He'd take out his treasures, flint and steel. He'd scrape together the bark, dust, and dry moss he'd kept tucked against his skin to stay dry. He'd strike the flint. One spark. Two. Nothing. The wind howled as if the universe were laughing at his small existence. He swore. Cursing is fuel for the soul. He struck again. A spark caught on the tinder. A thin wisp of smoke rose. Now the delicate part. He blew not too hard, just enough to nurse it. The smoke thickened. And then a tiny, precious orange flame. It felt holy. A campfire was not only warmth. It was companionship. For months on end, it could be the only voice that answered him. It crackled. It hissed. It was the only living creature in that frozen world that wanted him to survive. Sitting beside it, swaddled in stinking hides, he wasn't thinking about philosophy. He was thinking how long it will last and whether your shoes will catch fire before your toes go numb. Fire demanded respect. Be careless, and the wind would snatch it away. Sleep too close, and a spark would steal the only blanket you had. The mountain man did not expect comfort. He manufactured survival. As for food, Mountain men didn't eat for pleasure. They ate for thermodynamics. Calories were logs for the furnace within. Nutrition was a luxury for people who lived where vegetables existed. The menu was set by two factors: what moved slower than you and how desperate you were. Beaver tail was considered a delicacy, not because it tasted like beef, but because it was a slab of pure, glorious fat. They'd roast it over embers until the pebbled skin blistered and blackened, and the hot fat ran. Liquid gold, marrow, brains. Awful. Anything with a high calorie count. Meat, so old it was technically historic, still beat nothing. Pemmican was the staple dried bison pounded to powder, mixed with melted fat and sometimes dried berries. Hard enough to break teeth, but it could keep you alive through winter. They carried it in hide bags, scraping some off with a knife to chew without emotion. Coffee was brewed from roasted watercress. Whiskey was painkiller, antiseptic, and sometimes breakfast. Gourmet meant anything that didn't kill you immediately. And when supplies ran out, ingenuity took the throne. They ate horse. They boiled their rawhide belts. They boiled their boot soles and called it leather soup. When you're chewing footwear, language tends to lose nuance. They didn't eat to live well. They ate to keep living, and that was already an ambitious goal in their world. Loneliness was a mountain man's constant companion, loud, moody, and always there when you didn't want it. For months on end, the only sounds were the wind's shriek, the crunch of snow underfoot, and the trembling drum of your own heart. The silence of the wild wasn't peace. It was a warning. A sudden hush in the forest meant something was watching you, weighing whether you were dinner. Isolation reshaped the mind. Men talked to themselves until their voices began to sound like strangers. They argued with their echoes and lost. They named their rifle, their knife, their favorite trap, not because they were childish, but because something had to answer back eventually. Their true companions were animals. The horse that carried his gear and silent judgment, and the dog, if he was lucky. The dog was hunter, sentry, heater, and therapist rolled into one. Lose the dog and you might as well dig two holes, one for it and one for your sanity. They didn't survive because they were stronger. They survived because they noticed. They learned to read snow like a theologian reads scripture. They could smell a storm, taste ice in the air, feel pressure changes in their bones. Modern civilization calls it intuition. Mountain men called it attention. And then it ended not in some glorious battle, but in a slow obsolescence. The civilization they'd fled finally caught up. The fur trade collapsed. Fashion in Europe shifted. Silk hats replaced beaver felt. Just like that, their reason to exist evaporated. Railroads screamed, slashing across their silent land. Telegraphs clicked, filling the air with messages they couldn't decipher. Settlers poured in, bringing fences, cattle, and far too many people who thought frostbite was a myth. The mountain men faded. Some became guides to settlers, muttering warnings no one heeded. They watched families roll west with pianos and fine china, and shook their heads at such well-organized foolishness. Others opened trading posts, spending their final winters selling watered whiskey at a premium to people who called this adventure. A stubborn few simply went deeper into the mountains, following the last winters, and never came back. They weren't made different. They were built colder, and in a world growing warmer, easier, and noisier, there was no room for them. They were relics of a harsh truth. Warmth is temporary, but cold is eternal. And they were the only ones mad enough to call the cold home. A mountain man's fire was a personal, solitary war against oblivion. In another age, on another continent, fire was not just individual survival. It was the smoky, pounding heart of an entire society. Step into a medieval kitchen, and the first thing that hits you isn't food. It's smoke, not the fragrant, romantic wisp of a modern hearth. This is a dense, stinging cloud, coiling like a living creature from an open hearth, a fire pit so big you could roast a wild boar and simmer a cauldron the size of a bathtub. This smoky chaos was the beating heart of every household. from a peasant's ramshackle hut to a lord's fortified hall. Before efficient chimneys, smoke escaped wherever it could, through a hole in the roof, if you were lucky, or simply through cracks in doors and windows. Soot stained everything: walls, beams, and the lungs of everyone who worked there. Cooking wasn't just a chore. It was ritual, chemistry, and a touch of witchcraft all at once. In peasant huts, that single fire did it all. It was the only heat, the only light after sunset, and the place where raw, often meager, ingredients were turned into something edible. The fire was sacred, a tiny, capricious god, needing constant care. To lose it midwinter wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. In great castles, the kitchen was often a separate building, a sensible precaution against runaway flames consuming the lord's living quarters. Here, the chaos multiplied. It was a living machine operated by humans. Spitboys, usually the lowest of the low, whose only job was to sit by the fire for hours, turning the meat, sweat pouring, eyes burning with smoke. Scullions, scrubbing heavy iron cauldrons, black with soot, master cooks, orchestrating it all like generals before battle, barking orders amid knives, pans, and dogs yapping for scraps. This was no place for the faint-hearted. It was a battlefield where smoke, ash, and flame wrestled for dominion. And in that chaos, survival met superstition. Housewives stirred the soup with one hand and crossed themselves with the other, whispering that the pot must be stirred clockwise, or the devil would spoil the meal. Nothing announced your status in the medieval world more clearly than what you ate. A poor man's bowl and a noble's plate told two entirely different stories. For peasants, the vast majority, food was fuel, not joy. Their menu was a repetition of whatever sprouted from the soil. Pottage, the daily staple, so thick you could stand a spoon in it. Commonly barley, rye, or oats, with whatever vegetables were on hand. Leeks, onions, and cabbage. If it isn't gray, it isn't done. Bread, dark, coarse, heavy. In famine times, padded with sawdust or bark. Meat, a rare luxury, reserved for feast days and weddings. Beef and pork were for the Lord. A lucky peasant might get a taste of bacon or a hen that had outlived her laying days. For nobles, food was theater and exhibition of power and wealth. Display, they didn't just eat, they performed extravagance. Swans roasted whole, then redressed in their feathers. Peacocks stuffed, gilded, and paraded like trophies. They didn't taste good. Peacock is tough, but that didn't matter. They looked magnificent. Meat, tables heaped with boar, venison, hare, and a galaxy of birds. Subtleties, sculpted sugar or pastry, dragons of sugar, almond nights served between courses to dazzle guests. Even servants had hierarchies. Those seated above the salt, near the Lord, mattered. Those below did not. If the medieval kitchen had a secret weapon, it was spice, not just salt and pepper, but the treasures worth their weight in gold: cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and above all, black pepper. These weren't mere flavorings. They were symbols of power, wealth, and refinement, carried from the distant east along perilous routes, stalked by pirates and plague. Sprinkling pepper on a stew was like wearing a Rolex to dinner. Venice built its empire on those tiny grains. They also served a darker double purpose: masterful disguise. Before refrigeration, meat often arrived with a personality and not a pleasant one. It turned. A skilled medieval cook knew a fistful of cloves and cinnamon could mask the rot, turning dubious cuts into aromatic dishes. Sugar, too, was treated as a spice. The wealthy didn't reserve it for dessert. They sweetened meats, fish, and sauces, creating a palate alien to ours, blurring the line between savory and sweet. Imagine turkey drumsticks meeting gingerbread. Medieval cooks weren't just cooking, they were practicing medicine. Every dish was governed by the theory of the four humors: blood, hot and wet; phlegm, cold and wet; yellow bile, hot and dry; black bile, cold and dry. Health came from balancing these fluids. Foods were classified accordingly. Fish was considered cold and wet; pepper, hot and dry. A good cook had to balance your ingredients or risk deranging the body. Hence, fish cold often came with hot sauces, or a dusting of ginger hot. Wine, hot and dry, balanced cold dishes. When your lord shaved nutmeg over his plate, he wasn't just showing off. He was dispelling melancholy, thought to arise from black bile. Cooking was a small-scale act of cosmic equilibrium. In the end, the church decided what you ate. The medieval calendar was divided not only by seasons, but by fasts and feasts. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, an absolute ban on meat, dairy, and eggs. Fish days, Fridays, and sometimes Wednesdays and Saturdays forbade meat. This turned fish into a colossal business. Herring and cod were salted, smoked, and shipped across Europe. Far from the sea, fish might be salted to near immortality, but cooks were inventive. In monasteries and rich houses they made imitation meats, molding fish into the shape of roast birds, or used almond milk as a common dairy substitute. The reason medieval recipes feature it so often wasn't vegan fashion, but religious rule. And when feast days came, abundance was unleashed. Christmas or Easter meant roast oxen, honeyed breads, and rivers of ale, celebrating salvation as much as satiety. In the medieval kitchen, every dish told a story of faith, fear, class, and the craft of survival. Its legacy lingers in our sauces, our holiday roasts, and the idea that food feeds the soul as surely as it feeds the body. The medieval church ruled the kitchen, deciding what could enter the body, but its power didn't stop at food. It ruled souls, and when faith curdled into fear, it became a weapon more terrifying than any kitchen knife. In the 1630 seconds, France was no place for the faint-hearted. Under Cardinal Richelieu's iron hand, the nation was reforged. The religious wars between Catholics and Huguenots had quieted, but suspicion had not. Faith wasn't a personal choice. It was a mandate of state. In this stifling air, the devil was no metaphor. They believed devils lurked behind every illness, every temptation, every sleepless night. The devil was tangible, an active agent in the world, forever seeking a crack in the soul. And Laudun was a town full of cracks, set in central France. Laudun was a place that should have been entirely forgettable. Narrow streets, modest churches, a devoutly nervous populace. The town had a history of friendliness to Protestants, making it a thorn in Richelieu's centralizing eye. People muttered about new policies, prayed in public, and regarded one another with a blend of piety and suspicion. At the center of this brittle calm stood the Ursuline convent, a gilded cage. Behind its walls were young women from noble families, sent to find holiness, or at least avoid scandal. Their lives were a strict loop of prayer, silence, and labor. Cut off from the world, brides of Christ, locked in an environment of emotional and physical repression. The convent was not just a sanctuary, it was a psychological pressure cooker waiting to blow. Every tragedy needs a villain. For his enemies, Father Urbain Grandier was born to play the part. He was everything a 17th century priest was not supposed to be. Dangerously handsome, silver-tongued, His sermons were not dull homilies, but stage performances that pulled crowds. Above all, he was arrogant. He walked the town as if he owned it, and in many ways he did. Grandier's intellect was matched only by his defiance. Politically, he openly opposed Richelieu's orders to tear down the town's walls, a direct challenge. He made himself a political nuisance. Personally, he was worse. Whispers followed him like incense smoke. He was rumored to have fathered a child, to have seduced widows. Women came to confess and stayed longer than necessary. He was a rock star in a cassock, and he knew it. That blend of political defiance and personal scandal earned him a formidable enemies list. They waited, hunting for the perfect weapon. They didn't expect it to come from holiness itself, the Ursuline convent. The convent needed a spiritual director. Grandier, as the town's most famous priest, was the obvious choice. He refused out of arrogance, perhaps, or genuine busyness. That decision sealed his fate. The prioress, Sister Jeanne des Anges, Jeanne of the Angels, possessed an imagination as fierce as her faith. Locked behind walls, perhaps repressed and frustrated, the refusal wounded her pride. Soon, Sister Jeanne began to have visions. She confessed that Grandier haunted her dreams. She said he appeared in her cell at night, whispering temptations and caresses. His specter was angel and demon both. It was a shocking confession. Was it true? Or the forbidden erotic fantasies of a repressed woman, dressed by her imagination in demonic shape? It didn't matter. Her confession spread through the convent like fire. Fear travels faster than plague. Within weeks, other nuns began to report visions of Grandier's ghostly visits, of demons crawling through their rooms. End quote. A priest had turned into a phantom, a convent into a theater, and Laudun, already taught, was about to snap. Hysteria began. No longer private dreams, public, violent spectacle. One by one the nuns convulsed, screamed, and collapsed in the chapel. They cursed in Latin they had never been taught, scratched at the altar, and shouted Grandier's name as if he were both tormentor and savior. Sister Jeanne was the loudest. She claimed possession by an army of devils, Leviathan, Behemoth, Astaroth. She twisted her body into impossible shapes. Witnesses swore they saw her float inches above the ground. Laudun became a circus. News spread. Exorcists, eager to battle Satan himself, flocked to town. Crowds gathered outside the convent gates just to hear the nuns' screams. And something odd. The possessions grew more theatrical whenever there was an audience. Women, stripped of voice and power, suddenly found themselves center stage. Their bodies were a battlefield, and they were the stars. Grandier's enemies saw their chance. This was no longer about faith. It was politics. Richelieu's agents were present. They recognized that this supernatural event was perfect divine confirmation for ending a political nuisance. Public exorcisms turned into interrogations. "Who sent you?" the exorcists shouted into contorted faces. The answer, from a demon's throat, was always the same: Urbain Grandier. They extracted supposed pacts signed between Grandier and devils, written in Latin and sealed in blood. Crude forgeries, but in that paranoid air, iron proof. The stage was set. The church, sensing peril and opportunity, had its scapegoat. In 1634, Father Urbain Grandier was arrested. His guilt was settled long before the trial began. He was dragged before a commission headed by his nemesis, Jean de Laubardemont, Richelieu's agent. The trial was a farce. Nuns were brought in to writhe and shriek in court, pointing at him. The demonic contracts were displayed. Grandier mocked their absurdity, a fatal mistake. His scorn was read as the devil's pride. He was savagely tortured. His legs were crushed in the boots. Wooden boards hammered tight to splinter bone. Priests demanded confession. Repent! Even in agony, Grandier refused. He insisted on his innocence. My only crime, he said, is to have offended the powerful. On the 18th of August 1634, the town square was turned into a sacred stage. Shattered by torture, Grandier was dragged to the stake and burned alive. As the flames rose, the crowd watched. Some said they saw a white dove escape the fire, his innocent soul. Others saw smoke curl in the shape of a mocking smile. The church declared victory. The devils were cast out. There was one problem. After Grandier died, the nuns kept convulsing. The possessions sputtered on for years. Without Grandier to blame, the chaos felt empty, almost rehearsed. Sister Jeanne des Anges, instigator of all, became a celebrity. She toured France telling her story, even claiming to bear invisible stigmata. She turned her tragedy into fame. Centuries later, historians and psychologists look back on Loudun and see a plain truth. No demons came up from hell. The devils had been there from the start. They were human devils. The collective hysteria born of sexual and psychological repression. The demon of political ambition, Richelieu. The demon of personal envy, Grandier's foes. And the greatest demon, fear, the thing that turns neighbors into witch hunters and faith into a deadly weapon. Loudun remains a warning, a stain on the church's cloak, reminding us how easily reason collapses when dressed in holy robes. The tragedy at Loudun was public theater, the church hunting and punishing sin, real or imagined, with fire to assert its power. In Paris, in an age not long before, the church's relationship with sin was far more complicated. Instead of burning it, they managed it and profited from it. Medieval Paris was a symphony of contradictions, a city haunted by sin and salvation. By day, the air rang with church bells. Notre Dame's great towers rose like a stone assertion of God's power. Monks walked the cobbles chanting hymns. Sorbonne students argued fiercely over the nature of the soul. Paris was the heart of Christendom, holy and devout. By night, another city emerged. In the same narrow lanes, laughter, whispers, and the rustle of cloaks slipping through forbidden doors replaced the hymns. Hidden behind bakeries and taverns, an underground economy thrived, trading not in gold or grain, but in pleasure. From the pulpit, the church thundered that lust was a mortal sin, an express lane to hell. Yet priests walked past these brothels every day. The truth was that the city's moral order rested on the very sins it publicly denounced. Brothels were the pressure valve of a society obsessed with purity. They were where men indulged what the church forbade, so they could return to the confessional on Sunday, absolved and ready to sin again. For those in the know, Paris was a map of temptation drawn in invisible ink. Sin wasn't the city's secret, it was its second heartbeat. The women who worked in these houses were ghosts by day and queens by night. Society called them sinners, but they did not choose this life. It chose them. They were the byproducts of a harsh world. Poverty, war, famine, country girls fleeing failed harvests, widows whose husbands died in endless wars, or wives abandoned. In a society where a woman without family or husband was essentially invisible, the brothel wasn't moral decay, it was survival. At least there, they had food, warmth, and a roof none guaranteed to the respectable poor outside. Inside those walls, another hierarchy reigned. Older, seasoned women became madams, sharp-eyed entrepreneurs, in a world that did not permit women to do business. They ran the operation with sharp tongues and clear heads, handled finances, bargained with landlords, often church bodies, and paid guards for protection. These women held a peculiar power. They knew secrets. They heard confidences whispered by knights, priests, and clerics. They knew who desired what, who owed money, who led double lives. In a world that judged them, knowledge was both shield and quiet revenge. Brothel clients were a cross-section of medieval society, a parade of men united by appetite. Knights, fresh from battle, seeking release. Chivalry demanded respect for women, but only certain kinds. Prostitutes were a safe sin, neither wives nor virgins, existing to absorb the desire polite society disowned. Merchants, fat with market profits, for whom pleasure was just another kind of transaction. Deals closed in warm beds as often as at stalls. Students from nearby Sorbonne, drunk on wine and theology, arguing morality by day and experimenting with it by night. And the clergy, the most controversial and often the most faithful customers. Priests and monks, vowed to chastity, were frequently the most loyal patrons. This hypocrisy was an open secret. Chroniclers joked that half the city's priests conducted private ministries in tavern back rooms. In these alleys, sin was the only democracy. A noble and a poor student might share the same jug and the same woman, both shedding their identities in the dark. Here lay the central contradiction. The church didn't just look away. It managed and profited from the trade. Officially, it roared from the pulpit that lust was the gateway to hell. Unofficially, it directed traffic. Their logic was oddly pragmatic. Theologians argued prostitution was a lesser evil, even a necessary evil. Controlled brothels would keep men from corrupting respectable women, their wives and daughters. By channeling male desire into an organized outlet, they safeguarded marriage's sanctity. Thus, the commerce of sin became a form of moral husbandry. The complicity wasn't just philosophical, it was financial. Taxes, the city, often in concert with church officials, taxed them heavily. Operating fees, security fees, even candle fees for the window to signal they were open. Property. Records show Parisian clergy collected rent from houses of ill repute. Some convents even owned properties leased to madams, a tidy arrangement where sacred coin mingled seamlessly with sinful profit. Regulation. They enforced rules. Prostitutes were barred from living near churches and had to wear distinct clothing, often bright red, to mark them, both badge of shame and advertisement. King Louis IX, St. Louis, tried to abolish brothels entirely in 1254. Within a year, they quietly reopened city, and church realized they couldn't forego the revenue and feared social chaos without them. The church could claim to guard heaven's gates, but in Paris it also rented rooms on the road to hell. The balance couldn't hold. In the late 14th and 15th centuries, catastrophe struck. The Black Death scythed through Europe, killing a third of the population. Then came the 100 Years' War. In this atmosphere of death and despair, views on sin shifted. Lust was no longer a manageable, necessary evil. It became a symbol of God's punishment. Preachers ranted that plague was God's scourge for Paris's moral rot. Prostitutes turned from service providers into walking contagions, embodiments of civic decay. A hardline wave of religious reform swept in. Brothels were raided. Women were whipped and paraded through the streets. The church, once silent landlord and taxman, now turned on them ferociously, condemning the very women it had profited from. Sin did not disappear. It merely changed address. It moved from regulated, taxed houses to filthy alleys, more dangerous, more desperate, and far less profitable to the city. The legacy of those houses, the central contradiction of medieval Paris, remains. It lies beneath the cobbles, the memory of an era when sanctity and hypocrisy were two faces of the same coin. Paris built great churches to save its soul and rooms to tempt it. In that tension, the city found its truest self. If cold taught people how to bargain with death, then fire in the kitchen, in the church, in the streets, exposed the bargains struck with conscience itself, between survival and honor, between faith and power, between admonition and desire. Thanks for walking with me through these three crossroads of history, from far western snow huts to medieval hearth, then into Paris's alleys. In the next part, we'll open more doors, the tables of seafaring explorers, the spice markets of Venice, or the prison kitchens of the witch hunts. Which would you like to visit first? See you in the next story.